Hello, welcome back to Mrs. Riley's Maths videos, and today we're looking at indices, and in particular at law 5, 6, 7, 8 and 9. So we've got 5 laws to look at today. The first 2 laws are particularly challenging, so we're going to take a bit more time on those, and we'll try and work out what they're saying. Don't forget, these laws are in your formula tables, so you don't have to learn them. If you do become so familiar with them that they're easier to use, that's great. But if you don't worry, they're in your formula tables. Okay, so those are in your formula tables. This is this one is all about what's called fractional indices. Fractional indices, and that's because the indice is a fraction. Okay, not rocket science yet, I suppose. The indice is a fraction. So the power is a fraction. So when we have something like a to the power of 1 over q, that's how we say it. So written like that means it said a to the power of 1 over q. Okay, what we're saying is that refers to a root of some kind. Okay, so if we have a to the power of 1 over q, it refers to a root. Let's talk through what some examples of this would look like with numbers first of all, and then maybe it will make it clearer. So for instance, you might have 4 to the power of a half, and 4 to the power of a half means the square root of 4. That's what the law is saying. 4 to the power of a half is the square root of 4, which as we know is 2. Now usually we don't write that little 2. Usually we just say it's the square root of 4 is 2, and we don't bother putting the little 2. But 4 to the power of a half means the square root of 4. So 9 to the power of a half is the square root of 9, which is 3. And we have something like 16 to the power of a half would be the square root of 16, which would be 4. So to the power of a half means square root. Okay, to the power of a half means a square root. X to the power of a half is the square root of x. Then we have other fractions though. We might have something like 27 to the power of a third, and that means the cube root of 27. Now if you remember, the cube root of something means that we're looking for the number that multiplies by itself and by itself again to give 27. So we know that 3 cubed is 27. The cube root of 27 is 3. Or let's take 64 to the power of a third. That means the cube root of 64. What number multiplies by itself and by itself again to get 64 is 4. So the cube root of 64 is 4. We have some other ones, like we might have the fourth root of 16, which means what number multiplies by itself and by itself and by itself again to get 16, and that's 2, because 2 by 2 by 2 by 2 equals 16. We might have the fifth root of 32, which means what number multiplies by itself and by itself again to get 32, and that's 2. Okay, so to the power of a fraction means that as a root. Okay, hopefully that's beginning to make sense to you. Now with letters it's harder to see, but it's not impossible. So with letters we usually just have to get from one, either the root to the fraction power, or from the fraction power to the root. So for example, we might have something like x to the power of a half, and they want us to recognize that that means the square root of x. Or they might have x to the power of a third, they want us to recognize that that's the cube root of x. Or possibly more likely, they might have the square root of a, and we have to realize that we can write that as a to the power of a half, or the fifth root of a, and we have to recognize that we can write that as a to the power of a fifth. So that's how the rule works. What it might say is find the value of each of these. Find the value of each of these, and it might be something like the square root of 25, and we'd say, well, that's 25 to the power of a half, which is 5. Or it might say 16 to the power of a half, and we'd say it's 16 to the power of a half, that's 16, that's the square root of 16, so that's 4. Or 36 to the power of a half is the square root of 36, which is 6. Or we might have that 125 to the power of a third, well, that's the cube root of 125, which is 5. Okay, so that's how that rule would work out. And we'll look at how it interacts with other rules, or how it works with other rules, in a little while. The second rule that we're going to go on to is law 6, which is actually, I think, more complicated again. So here's law 6 over here. Here's law 6. So law 6 has, let's do it on a new page over here. Law 6. Law 6 says that a to the power of p over q means this. It means a to the power of p, and then find the qth root of that. A to the power of p. So this one up here is a to the power of p, and this one here is a to the power of 1 over q. Let me show you what that looks like. So for example, with a number, I might have something like 64 to the power of 3 over 2. And what that means is it's 64 cubed, and then find the square root of it. Okay, or it could mean the square root of 64 cubed. Both of those count as fine. Okay, so let's just see, how would we do that on our calculator? So we've used this button before as to the power of, and this button here is the root one that we were talking about before. So if we were to do the square root, so let's just see, 64 to the power of a third. Let's do that first. 64 with that button, and let's just turn it on. 64 x to the power of button. Let me do that again. 64 x to the power of, and in this case it's 3, so I'm doing a fraction, 3 over 2 equals 512. Okay, 64 to the power of 3 over 2 is 512. But let's do it doing this way. 64 squared is 4096. So what we're doing here is the square root of 4096, and the square root of 4096 equals 64. Well, that's what we just got to. Sorry, 64 cubed is 4096. I must have done squared. 64 cubed. Aha. 64 cubed is 262144. And then that's the cubed bit. That's 64 cubed. The square root of 64 cubed then will be the square root of that. So it'll be the square root of 262144. So the square root of 262144, which is 512, the same answer. Okay, or how about this version? Find the square root of 64. Square root of 64, which is 8, and cube it. 8 cubed is 512. So each of those ways of unpacking this is the same answer. We each get 512 each time. So what is happening here again is that when we have a number or a letter to a power, which is a fraction, now it's not just a 1 over fraction like we had a minute ago, it's two numbers on the fraction, like p over q, like 3 over 2. The bottom one is a root and the top one is a power that's going to make it bigger. So let's look at what we might have here. Let's try and find some examples. So we might have 16 to the power of 3 over 2. That's the same as this one over here, isn't it? It's still a 3 over 2 power. So what that means is either the square root of 16 cubed, okay, or it means 16 cubed and then find the square root. They're both the same thing. I think this one's easier to do because I know the square root of 16 is 4. So it's 4 cubed, and 4 cubed is 64. I don't actually know what 16 cubed is. I'll have to do it here. 16 cubed is 4096. And I'm trying to find the square root of 4096. 4096, which is 64. So I think this one is actually easier to do. It's easier to find the root first and then to cube it. Let's find another question here. 8 to the power of 2 over 3. 8 to the power of 2 over 3. Well, that's going to be either the cube root of 8 squared, or it's going to be the cube root of 8 and then square it. So the cube root of 8 squared, this one's not too bad actually, because I do know that 8 squared is 64, and I know that the cube root of 64 is 4, so I can manage that actually. This one though might be easier. The cube root of 8 is 2, and 2 squared is 4. So either way I end up with the same answer. Different ways of unpacking the same question. Okay, so how would it look in letters? If I was asked, if I had a to the power of, let's say, 2 over 3, I would know that what they mean by that is the cube root of a squared. And equally, if I found that I had, say, a 4 and a cubed, I could rewrite that as a to the power of 3 over 4. So the number underneath the square root here goes on top. The number in the arm or the elbow here of the square root goes underneath. Okay, so x to the, let's say, the fifth root of x squared, like that, would be x to the power of 2 over 5. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. It is the hardest rule, I think. Now, that's law 6. Law 7 over here. A to the power of minus p is equal to 1 over a to the power of p. A to the power of minus p is equal to 1 over a to the power of p. So how does this look like with numbers, first of all? So with numbers, we've got something like 2 to the power of minus 3. That's saying that that's 1 over 2 to the power of 3, which would be 1 over 8. Okay. 4 to the power of minus 2 would be 1 over 4 squared, which would be 1 over 16. 5 to the power of minus 2 would be 1 over 5 squared, which would be 1 over 25. Okay, let's try and find a slightly harder one. Let's say 4 to the power of minus a half, using the rule we've just done. Well, that would be 1 over 4 to the power of a half, which would be 1 over the square root of 4, which would be 1 over 2. Okay, and let's look, what's the next two roots? Yeah, okay, so I haven't done the next two rules yet, so we'll come back to those in a minute. Let's try and find another one with a negative. Oh yeah, 8 to the power of minus a third would be 1 over the cube root of 8, which would be 1 over 2. Now this does work the other way as well, strangely, that if I have 8 to the power of minus p, that means 1 over 8 to the power of p, but it also means that 1 over a to the power of minus p is actually a to the power of p. So basically what the negative does, the negative inverts it, it turns it upside down. So for example, what that would look like is if I had 1 over 2 to the power of minus 3, that would be 2 to the power of plus 3, which would be 8. Or 1 over 5 to the power of minus 2 would be 5 to the power of 2, which would be 25. So that negative power inverts our fraction, I guess. So it turns it upside down. Okay, I hope that's making a little bit of sense. Next rule is law 7. Law 7 says that if we have two numbers multiplying together in a bracket, and then we raise that to the power of something, it's the same as raising each of them to the power in turn. So for instance, if I have 2 by 5 to the power of 3, that's the same as 2 cubed by 5 cubed. Let's just check that out and see if it's true. 2 by 5 to the power of 3 would be 10 to the power of 3, which would be 1000. And 2 cubed by 5 cubed would be 8 by 125, which would also be 1000. So it's the same thing. Okay. What about if I had 4x to the power of 3? Well, that would be 4 cubed x cubed, which would be 64 x cubed. Or what about if I had something like, let's try and find another one that's a bit like that. Yeah, say I had 5n squared cubed. That would be 5 cubed by n squared cubed. Now, do you remember this from before? When you've got a power to a power, this one's fine. 5 cubed is 125. N squared cubed is n to the power of 2 times 3, which is 6. So that would be 125 n to the power of 6. Why is that? Well, that's because it's 5n squared by 5n squared by 5n squared, which is 5 by 5 by 5 is 125. N squared by n squared by n squared is n to the power of 6. So that would be that rule. Okay, if you've got two numbers that are written as a product and they're raised to a power, then each of them is raised to the power in turn. Okay, and law 9 is similar to that. Law 9 says that if you have two numbers dividing by each other and they're raised to a power, then it's the same as the top one being raised to the power divided by the bottom one to be raised to the power. So an example of this might be something like 9 over 16 to the power of a half. 9 over 16 to the power of a half, that would be the same as 9 to the power of a half over 16 to the power of a half, which is the same as the square root of 9 over the square root of 16, which would be 3 over 4. Okay, that's a lot, isn't it? It's a lot trying to deal with those two things. Let's see. 1 over 2 to the power of 3 is the same as 1 to the power of 3 over 2 to the power of 3, which is 1 over 8. 2/3 to the power of 2 is the same as 2 squared over 3 squared, which equals 4 over 9. Okay, hopefully this is beginning to make sense. 8 over 27 to the power of a third, so it's a bit more complicated, is the same as 8 to the power of a third over 27 to the power of a third, which is the same as the cube root of 8 over the cube root of 27, which is 2 over 3. Okay, so hopefully you're understanding those 5 laws. I'm just going to do some slightly more challenging questions in the next video so you can see how they work out in practice. Okay, so thank you. Bye-bye.